So this talk is going to focus on the classification of micronutrients. So as part of this topic in week 1, we're going to look at the classification of micronutrients, so carbohydrates, fat and protein. We're going to then look at classification of micronutrients, but we'll do that together as synchronously, and that will be vitamins and minerals. And then at the end of this topic, we are going to have a discussion about whether carbohydrates are bad for you. So we're going to have for and against. So the learning outcomes for this topic are to be able to understand and identify the different types of macro and micronutrients, be able to understand the different classifications for both macro and micronutrients, be able to list sources of macro and micronutrients, and be able to form an opinion on whether carbohydrates are bad for your health. So obviously a healthy diet is a combination of macro and micronutrients, and it results in appropriate growth and development, particularly for children. It results in the absence of illness or discomfort. So obviously if you have too little or too much of something, then both under and overnutrition can result in illness and obviously discomfort. And then it also results in fitness, longevity and health. So obviously if you have a diet that is inadequate both in terms of macro and micronutrients, this impacts on both short and long-term health. So if we look at the classification of macronutrients, there are actually 4. So water is included, but obviously that's a non-energy providing source. As 80 to 90% of your body is made up of water. So then we have protein, fat, and we have carbohydrates. But it's really difficult just to talk about macronutrients as we eat food. And obviously food is a combination of both macro and micronutrients. So the NHS Eat Well plate has tried to break this down into a pictorial schema showing how the various type of macro and micronutrients can be used, can be described as in terms of an Eat Well plate. So if you look at the green components of the pie, they are obviously made up of your fruits and vegetables. So they will contain most of your micronutrients and some macronutrients. The orangey part of the pie is made up of your starchy food, so they will contain mostly carbohydrates, but are also a source of protein. So wheat, for example, contains a lot of protein, so bread is in that. And then you've also got your protein-containing food, so your high biological value proteins, and your lower ones, such as your vegetable sources, so your meat, fish, nuts, peas, beans and lentils. And then you've got your dairy containing foods that are sources of both macro and micronutrients, and particularly with regards to your minerals such as phosphorus, calcium and magnesium, and your fat soluble vitamins such as A and D. And then the things that you need in the smallest amount are your fats, which are your oils and your solid fats. So this can be further broken down to, so the classification can be into essential and non-essential nutrients. So essential nutrients are those that cannot be synthesized in humans. So these are all of your minerals, most of your vitamins, 9 of your amino acids are essential, and 2 of your fatty acids are essential. So your linoleic and linolenic fatty acids are essential, and the human body cannot make those. So there are no pathways for those. So these must come from the diet. So if you have a deficiency of linoleic or linolenic acid, you will have a breakdown. Your skin will end up being very dry. You will end up with amide acid deficiency. So you will have you can almost have a point where it mimics sepsis. So you have a very low white cell count, you have platelet dysfunction. So it's very important that individuals have sufficient fat in their diet, which for the most part is not difficult to do, but for some individuals this can be challenging, particularly, for example, infants or other individuals who are on special diets. So your non-essential nutrients, these can be synthesized in humans. So there are a few vitamins, so D and K are too. So vitamin D is obviously the main source of that in the human body is through the skin, and your vitamin D receptors in your skin and the pathways associated with that. And then vitamin K can be made in adults in the large bowel through your microflora. So in infants, vitamin K is an essential. So in neonates or newborn babies, this is an essential vitamin because babies aren't born being able to synthesize this, so they need vitamin K given to them at birth. And if they are vitamin K deficient, then they can have some hemorrhagic disorder. And then some of your amino acids, so 12 to be exact, can be made via other amino acids. And then many of your fatty acids and all of your carbohydrates are non-essential. So these can come from the diet, or they can be synthesized from other essential or non-essential nutrients. And then you have some conditionally essential nutrients. So sometimes when there are circumstances when non-essential nutrients become essential. So these become essential if they're not consumed in sufficient quantities. So sometimes as a result of a clinical state. So two examples would be preterm infants. So arginine, which is an amino acid, is essential in prematurity. The infant is unable to synthesize this in sufficient quantities. So therefore it is required as an exogenous amino acid. And then during somal injuries or critical illness, glutamine can become a conditionally essential amino acid. And this is the most readily available amino acid in the plasma. So this has the highest concentration in the plasma, but it is the majority of it comes from muscle. So where there is a very high turnover of muscle, particularly in critical illness, it can suddenly become a conditionally essential nutrient. So glutamine is used for a variety of different things. So in terms of macronutrients, they're all a source of energy except for water, and they're measured both in kilojoules and kilocalories. So a kilojoule is 4.2 times that of a calorie, so it's got the additional energy. So if you have 1 calorie, then the equivalent is 4.2 kilojoules. So macronutrients are those consumed in grams to hundreds of grams each day. So that's why they're called macro, because they're big. So 1 gram of carbohydrate equals 4 calories. 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories, so double the amount of that of carbohydrate, and protein, which is also 4 calories. And then alcohol is 7 calories. So someone who consumes a large amount of alcohol a day, a lot of their energy intake may actually be derived from alcohol. So the recommended daily calorie intake for women is 2,000 calories a day and 2,500 calories for men. However, it's important to note that this is based on a physical activity of 1.6. So this is a moderately active woman or man. So people who are more sedentary, they may only have a physical activity of between 1.2 and 1.4. So they may actually require fewer calories. So example would be an average woman who's got a physical activity of 1.4 may only require around 1,800 calories per day. And the same for a man, may require around 2,200 calories a day to meet their requirements. Otherwise, obviously, if you consume more calories than is necessary, then you end up with a energy surplus, and that then gets converted into adipose tissue or fat. So carbohydrates are your body's main energy source. So they are the major part of stored food in the body that's used for later as energy. So the carbohydrate that isn't used as glucose is stored as glycogen in the liver. Carbohydrate exists in 3 forms. So you've got sugar, starch, and fiber. So fiber is known as your non-starch polysaccharides. So the primary fuel of brain is glucose. Glucose can utilize ketones, such as if you were on a ketogenic diet or Atkins-style diet, but it prefers not to. Its most favored form of energy is glucose. So that's really important when we're thinking about whether carbohydrates are bad for you. your primary energy of your body is glucose. So if you have a very low or no carbohydrate containing diet, then it means that you must get your carbohydrate, or your glucose source must come from elsewhere. So the primary source of glucose when you don't take in a lot of carbohydrate would be protein. So your protein is then converted via gluconeogenic pathway into glucose. So as a result, although people often use Atkins-style diet or keto diet to lose weight, often what may be associated with the weight loss is the loss of muscle mass. So obviously muscle mass is the heaviest component within the body, excluding skeletal bone. And so weight loss that occurs as a result of this diet may be the loss of muscle mass rather than fat mass. So it's really important to think about when trying to advocate weight loss, what actually happens if people have a diet that may be different from normal physiological requirements of the body. So when people have a mixed diet, so if they are eating a carbohydrate and protein, the carbohydrate will be used for energy, so therefore it will spare the protein to be converted into energy, and therefore then protein can then be used for other things such as muscle building or tissue repair, etc. So excess carbohydrate, as I said, is stored in the liver as glycogen. Carbohydrates are also important for fat oxidation, and carbohydrate can also be converted into protein and vice versa. So this is a very complex schema, which I'm not intending to go through, but this just indicates the gluconeogenic and glycolytic pathway of glucose. So obviously when glycogen is stored in the liver, it can then be broken down by glycolysis back into glucose, which is then used, and gluconeogenic pathway can also be used for glucose into protein and vice versa. So carbohydrates, commonly, obviously, they are from fuel. They are from plants. So carbohydrates are the fuel for plants, and they're created using photosynthesis. And they have a composition of 3 elements. So they have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And obviously carbohydrates have varying complexity and structure from both a single glucose unit to complex starch. Carbohydrates can be divided into 3 main groups. So there is sugars, such as cake, honey, sugar, fizzy drinks, and chocolate. So anything that's really sweet. And starches, so they're more complex, bread, pasta, naan, potatoes, rice, and chapati. And obviously starches vary in their complexity as well. So you have retrograde starch, so starch which has been heated and then cooled, forms something called, forms a different starch molecule. So then it's harder to digest and takes longer. So if you're thinking about the glycemic index, white rice has a very high glycemic index, but actually if you tell someone to let the white rice cool and then reheat it, the glycemic index is changed because the retrograde starch is then present, and it takes much longer for that starch to be digested. And then you have cellulose. So obviously the cellulose forms is the stiff structure of plants. So it keeps the plant cell, it provides the structure to the plant cells. And you've got your fruit, whole grain, seeds, nuts, and vegetables have cellulose in them. And obviously in terms of fiber content, you've got soluble fiber and non-soluble fiber. Soluble fiber is very healthy for the bowel and has lots of sort of prebiotic properties. So your fructooligosaccharides and your galacto-oligosaccharides, so your FOS and GOS, whereas your insoluble fiber is kind of your it can't be digested and forms the bulk of your stool. But also important to remember that soluble fiber is also a bulking property of stool. So again, white rice is very high in soluble fiber and is a very good thing for people, for example, who have diarrhea. So it bulks and binds. So you don't need to have brown rice, which actually can be an irritant and have anti-nutrients in it. For example, if we had infants or children with gastroenteritis, we would always advise white rice and, for example, chicken, because that's a bulk and binding of the white rice and a good proteinaceous source for bowel repair and healing. So if we look at the classification of carbohydrates, looking at this diagram, we've got simple sugars, so we've got glucose and fructose, and then we've got galactose, which is made up, is a disaccharide made, it's a single sugar, and then you've got lactose, which is made up of galactose and glucose. Sucrose is 2 glucose molecules, and then you've got maltose. So your complex carbohydrates are obviously starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So fats are also known as lipids, and the terms are used interchangeably. So, for example, if we're thinking about a oral nutrition supplement or an enteral feed for people who are not able to eat by mouth orally or eating normal food, we would refer to the fat component within that as fat. Whereas if we were giving intravenous nutrition via parenteral nutrition, we would refer to the fat content of that as lipids. Also, if we were talking about the cell structure, we would refer to the lipid bilayer, which forms the outer layer of a cell, and that is then the type of lipid within that lipid bilayer is influenced by the dietary component. So if someone has a diet that's very high in omega-6 fatty acids, so sunflower oil, their lipid bilayer is going to be rich in omega-6 fatty acids. So it's going to be high in linoleic acid, which is then, if you have, for example, an illness, you are going to have a more pro-inflammatory response, whereas if you have a diet that's high in olive oil, such as your omega-9, your lipid bilayer will be rich in that, and then you will have a more neutral inflammatory response. So you're going to it's not going to be the same as if you have a diet that's high in omega-6, and then if you have a diet that's high in omega-3 fatty acids, such as your EPA, so your eicosapentaenoic acid, or your docosahexaenoic acid, so fish oils, then you're going to have an anti-inflammatory response to illness. So it's really interesting to think about the components of your diet and how that may influence a response to infection or disease. So in terms of composition, you've got 3 elements present. You've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they are made up of a glycerol backbone. So they've got carbohydrate in them, and then they have 3 fatty acids along the glycerol backbone. So during digestion, glycerol is separated from the fatty acids, and then the fatty acids are repackaged in the sort of brush border area, and they're formed in micelles, and then they're repackaged into chylomicrons, which are then transported via the lymphatic system to the liver. So then you've got 3 main types of lipids. You've got saturated fatty acids, so they are butter, as an example, and they are solid at room temperature. Then you've got polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as sunflower oil, and they tend to be liquid. And then you've got your monounsaturated fatty acids, so your MUFAs, which are olive oil, and they also tend to be liquid. Another example of saturated fatty acid would be coconut oil, and that tends to be solid at room temperature. So if you think of when you open up a tin of coconut milk, you'll often have a solid bit at the top, and that is the coconut fat that is solid at room temperature. So in terms of your classification of lipids, you have your saturated and your unsaturated. So saturated means that all the bonds are taken up, and your unsaturated, some of the bonds are free. So you may have lots of free bonds or single free bonds. And then you've obviously got your 2 essential fatty acids as part of that. So protein is made up from amino acids. So you've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So it's really important to understand that amino acids are the only component that contain nitrogen, and that's essential for growth. So if you think about fertilizer, So fertilizers are nitrogen containing, and they're put on crops or grass to make it grow. So it's the same as amino acids. So if we don't take enough amino acids, then we don't have sufficient growth or repair of tissue. And in infants and preterm infants particularly, we don't have growth, and also children. So these elements, protein is made up, are called amino acids, so they're single blocks, and protein is formed up a number of amino acids joined together by peptide links to form a chain. So you can have short chain peptides with just a couple of amino acids, or you can have polypeptides that have thousands of amino acids in one chain. So you have 21 amino acids in total, 9 of which are essential, and protein can be further divided into high biological value protein, which contains animal protein and soya. So soya has the same amino acid content as meat, so it makes it a very important protein source, particularly in vegan and vegetarian plant-based diets. And the reason why animal protein and soya is known as high biological value is that amino acids in animal cells is comparable to the pattern in human cells. Lower biological value, so you would need to eat more of it to have the same effect, is plant protein, nuts and seeds. So when we're thinking about a vegan diet or vegetarian diet, it's really important to think about how the different types of protein sources are mixed to make sure that there is the similar provision of amino acids, particularly the non-essential, particularly the essential amino acids within a diet. Because otherwise, if you don't have, if a diet is deficient in some amino acids, you will end up with disease as a result, and you will end up with, there will be negative sequelae that occur. So then in terms of your classification of amino acids, you have your branched chain amino acids, such as isoleucine, leucine, lysine, and valine. And then you've got histidine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, and tryptophan as all essential amino acids. So, for example, tryptophan is a really important neurotransmitter. So if you don't have enough of that, then obviously components of your pathways within your brain won't work well. Histidine is essential for the kidney. So if you don't have enough of that, then obviously you have kidney dysfunction. So that is a brief overview of the classification of macronutrients, and the next talk, the synchronous talk that we'll do together, will be looking at classification of micronutrients.